Last week, I gave you a short lecture on Plato and Aristotle and the classical tradition and classical ideal of leadership that comes from them. Um, they both hold this great man theory, as you saw, although Aristotle does develop, especially in the Nicomachean Ethics and the politics requirements for a ruler that you certainly don't see in the philosopher kings of Plato. But now we make about a 1600-year jump from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE to the 12th and 13th centuries CE of what used to be called the Christian era, but is now called the Common Era. And BCE now stands for before the Common Era. I think it's an attempt to secularize our understanding of things in a increasingly secular world. So we're going to move forward to the Middle Ages and stop for a few moments in the 5th century CE of the Common Era and talk a little bit about St. Augustine, who is really important in the history of ideas and the history of leadership. And I've put a copy of the Confessions up for you and for you to kind of roll through, because what I want you to note, as you see in my notes, is this shift from these third-person narrations that you see where even in autobiographies in ancient Greece and Rome, the third person is used. But Augustine's Confessions are all about the person, the singular person. He uses the pronoun I in a remarkably new way to bring this sense of standing outside of oneself and looking at oneself in one situation. So there's an acute self-awareness and self-consciousness that we don't see in a lot of other writings. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and go to this week's assignments. So I'll hit present now and give you a window, and then I will share. I will attempt to share. And I'm looking for, let's see. Let's try this again. All right, I think we've got this working now. So if we go to week 2, you'll see that we've moved into medieval and Christian views of leadership, and we've made this 1600-year jump, as I note. And the classic texts of Plato and Aristotle have been lost in the West through theft, fire, and suppression by the Christian Church. If you're interested, the book by Thomas Cahill, entitled How the Irish Saved Civilization, tells the story of how Irish monasteries, which were isolated from the Roman conquest of Britain, survived, because these classic texts of Plato and Aristotle were kept and were copied and recopied over time. It's a really interesting read, How the Irish Saved Civilization. But something else really important has entered the world, and that is Islam. And it has spread widely after the death of Muhammad in 632 CE. And I give you a little sense of this here in this link to the spread of Islam. And you can see by following this color code, Islam is born really in Mecca and Medina, and very quickly spreads throughout the Saudi Arabian peninsula, or the Arabian Peninsula at the time, by AD 634. And then you can see the continued spread of Islam up into Europe, what becomes Europe, and Asia and South Asia, and out into the islands, and then also into Africa, North Africa at first, and then sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see here that by 740, 750, Muslims cross the Strait of Gibraltar and get up into the Iberian Peninsula, into Spain. And so the Muslims become an important factor in the Iberian Peninsula. And if we go back to let's see if I can get back out of here. Back to my introduction to week 2, you'll see also that in addition to what the Irish had done in saving the classical tradition, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars in places like Seville, Granada, and Cordoba in the 10th through the 13th centuries were studying together these original texts by Plato and Aristotle. These Greek texts have been translated into Arabic and back into Latin during the Islamic Golden Age, the 10th through the 12th century CE, when Islam ruled most of Spain, all the way up to almost all the way up to Toledo. And these texts were made available to scholars like Thomas Aquinas, whose Christian theology is deeply influenced by Aristotle. And when you read the text from chapter 8 of our textbook, Traditional Classics on Leadership, it's a short treatise attributed to Aquinas entitled On the Government of Rulers. And Aristotle is quoted or referred to 17 times in this short reading. This period of time is often referred to as a convivencia, a period when allegedly Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together peacefully. And this is probably more fiction than fact. I misspelled fiction there. The truth is, when Muslims ruled, Jews and Christians were second-class citizens, and when Christians ruled, Jews and Muslims were second-class citizens. The Jews weren't ruling anybody at this time and weren't particularly interested in that. They tended to live in separate communities, separate Jewish communities in all of these cities, like Sevilla, Cordoba, and others there in Spain. I thought it was really interesting. I took a group of students to Morocco and Spain in 2015. So we got to visit North Africa, which is, at Morocco itself is 99% Islam, with the Berber population, who were the indigenous people before the Muslims came into North Africa. But the culture is primarily Muslim, and there are mosques all over the place. And then when you cross over into Spain, of course, the culture is primarily Christian, because in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, that same year expurged Spain of all Muslims and Jews. Now, some stayed behind, but most Muslims and Jews were kicked out of Spain in 1492. So I wanted you to take a look at the picture of Santiago Matamoros, and where did I have that? Somewhere in here. and if not, you can Google it. The translation is Saint James, the more killer, and Chris Lowney does a really nice job of talking about these centuries when Jews, Muslims, and Christians were living together. He argues that Santiago, St. James, is Janist faced. And he says, like the pilgrim pressing forward toward a destination, James the pilgrim symbolizes an inherently hopeful vision of history that is common to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The journey forward of flawed humankind towards some promised land or brighter future. On the other hand, after the Muslim takeover of Spain, many Spaniards answered the siren call of James the Muslim killer, patron of all those aggrieved parties who generation after generation would nurse old hatreds and perpetuate the cycle of violence suffered and vengeance sought. I think this interaction among Jews, Christians, and Muslims is really important for understanding the so-called Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. And they were dark only in the sense that I think Christianity was, and Judaism to a large extent, was diminished. And that's where we get this idea of the Dark Ages. But in fact, a great deal of learning occurred among Jews, Muslims, and Christians, as the classical tradition was both preserved and copied for future generations. So what I'm having you read then are chapters 8 and 12 in our textbook. And the first reading is by Thomas Aquinas, chapter 8, on the government of rulers. And the second reading is from Christine de Pizan's The Book of the Three Virtues. And what I've encouraged you to do to make sense of these sometimes obscure, sometimes obdurate, difficult texts to read is to attempt to find the main claim, the thesis statement. And most of the time, except in freshman essays, the thesis for an essay is found at the beginning. So most of the time, you're going to get that in these chapters from our textbook. But oftentimes, there's sort of a floating understanding of a topic that's being discussed, and you really don't get the thesis or the main claim until the end of the document. And in this document, I think pretty much right up front, Aquinas makes an implicit claim that one ruler is better than many rulers. And he's writing this to, we think, the king of Cyprus at the time, about how rulers ought to govern. And as I said before, he's heavily dependent upon Thomas Aquinas and Aquinas's writings to make his case. But something new has occurred here as well, and we'll see this in both Augustine and de Pizan. Christianity has entered the picture. Christians are influencing governments. Christians are in government, and the Bible is being quoted quite often now in a way that obviously we didn't see before in the readings about Plato and Aristotle. So on the government of rulers, Aquinas attempts to show that one ruler is better than many. And he argues that if you have one who governs the many, you're going to have unity as opposed to disunity. You're going to have the whole of a body pulling together if you have simply one head on the body. And kingship is best. But what Aquinas does throughout this selection is show that the worst, I mean, if you want one person in charge, a king or a queen, the worst form of government is the corruption of that single ruler, which is tyranny, which is the tyrant. And he develops this whole notion by pulling scripture in and talking about biblical leaders in the past and how they had to be virtuous in order to rule. They had to be holy in order to rule. And what he uses is reason, scripture, and the theological tradition that he has inherited. So with reason, he pulls Aristotle in and justifies his use of a pagan thinker to show that Aristotle's ideas about leadership were really pretty good. But then he also taps into scripture numerous times in order to show that there is a kind of biblical view of leadership. And then theology, which is really philosophy or some sort of interpretive schema interpreting scripture, is used to make the case overall. So that's Aquinas. And we have to jump back in time to Augustine, who's, let's see if we can get this to work. This is Project Gutenberg's version of the Confessions of St. Augustine. And, if you just click on book 1, for example, you can see the influence of Christianity, obviously. Great art thou, O Lord, and greatly to be praised, great is thy power, and so on and so forth. So you have all of this Christian theology undergirding Augustine's, you might want to call it his autobiography, but really it's a history of his conversion. And you'll notice that that here's where the pronoun I appears time and time again. And how shall I call upon my God and Lord, since when I call for him, I shall be calling him to myself. And what room is there within me, whither my God can come into me? I, me, my. Augustine is giving us something new here in the history of our understanding of leadership. And that is the leader's self-awareness, the leader's self-consciousness, the leader's sense of self as he or she moves through life. And again, I'm not going to spend much more time on this because you've got the link. And see if I can get back. And you can look at that. And come back to our course. Week 2. So take a look at Augustine's Confessions there. And then I have a short paper on Christina de Pizan and Helena Sisu, contemporary postmodern thinker, who claims that there is this thing called écriture féminine, and that is that there is a distinct form of writing which is female over and against male. I argue that actually de Pizan and Sisu's essays are pretty standard in terms of its rhetorical fare, its structure, and its language, and so on and so forth. That's not central to what we're looking at here, but it's really rather interesting. So if we look at de Pizan, this is this is taken from the Book of Three Virtues, and you need to ask yourself what these three virtues are. And I think you should identify this trinity of virtues, faith, hope, and love. And it's taken straight from 1 Corinthians 13. And now abide these three, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. The King James Version and other earlier versions, English versions of the New Testament, translated agape there. as charity, which is why Christine de Pizan and our translators use the word charity here. So in the Book of the Three Virtues, de Pizan is talking to women who are part of the royal court, courtesans, and how women are to conduct themselves. And I look forward to hearing your responses about this, because it's pretty clear that there's this whole culture among females in the courts of the 13th, 14th, and 15th century throughout Europe. But these women see themselves as submitting to their princes, as submitting to their husbands. And she argues that the greatest of the three virtues is, in fact, charity, and how charity, the pursuit of charity, the embracing of charity, the exercise of charity or love toward other courtesans, and also to those beneath them in the social hierarchy, is absolutely critical for women in the court. And she ends this on page 112 by saying that that women ought to really lay up their treasures in heaven and think about the world to come and not just this world. But in the meantime, you're going to find, I think, the thesis, and here's the spoiler, I'm giving it away, at the end of this chapter from the Book of Three Virtues, where de Pizan writes, in short, then, charity, joined to other noble virtues in her heart, will provide the benevolent princess with such goodwill that she will celebrate other people's worthiness as greater than her own and rejoice in their welfare as if it were her own. Their good reputation also will delight her. Accordingly, she will encourage the good to persevere in their virtue and the wicked to desist. So those are the three readings for this week: Augustine's 5th century Confessions, Aquinas' On the Government of Rulers, and the selection from de Pizan's The Book of Three Virtues. In addition to doing those readings for this week, we have a journal and a discussion. And for the journal, I want you to take a stab at selecting a contemporary leader to study. I've already heard back from 7 or 8 of you, but the rest of you need to pass somebody by me. And what I want you to do is select an influential person, a living contemporary leader whom you would like to research. And this is for the first paper for this course, which is due in week 6. I want this person to be high profile in the news, and this could be a political leader, a religious leader, a leader in industry or entertainment. Just make sure you pass this choice by your candidate, by me, for the green light for the examining leadership paper. And the fundamental question is, what do you hope to learn about leaders, leadership, and organizations through examining this particular influential leader? So that's the first journal that I want you to write. And instructions for how to do these journal entries can be found in the syllabus. I believe I finally put that in there. Let's just go to the course syllabus and see if I've got the latest version there. And here it is. It's the syllabus again. The objectives, stuff on APA, discussion boards. Okay, journals. Yeah, journal topics will be posted on Blackboard. You'll be reflecting on the readings, your experience, a specific topic or learning activity. These are personal reflections on your learning. Journals are less formal than papers, so you don't need to submit a paper, but can write up your journal and cut and paste it into Blackboard. Please do not submit it as a Word attachment in Blackboard. It makes it really cumbersome for me to get at it and then get back into Blackboard to do the grading. Include citations and references if you're using someone else's ideas or thoughts. You can assume that I know the theory. Focus on your experience and applications. And I think these entries should be plus or minus 500 words. And remember, the purpose of at least 2 of these journals is to get you up and running for these short papers on leadership, and to break the ground now before you have to submit the first paper in week 6 and the second paper in week 8, the final week of the class. So if we come back here to week 2, that's about the journals. And then finally, there's a discussion. But I do want you to look at the summary response writing, because going forward for these discussions, I want you to have a really nice summary of some part of one of the readings for the given week, and then a response to that. And if I click on this, you'll see that I've got a handout here to describe what summary response writing is. I've been using this for many, many years, where you read, summarize, and then you respond and apply. And one of the benefits of this kind of writing is when you go to write a paper or take an exam, you've summarized and responded to key primary and secondary texts of the course that you're taking. So look over that handout, and then do a summary response for your initial post in this discussion to either the short essay by Aquinas, the Pizan, or a section of Augustine's Confessions. For your summary, attempt to identify the thesis, and I've sort of given that away for you, or the main claim made by Aquinas, de Pizan, or Augustine, and put that at the beginning of your summary as a direct quotation. Remember, a thesis or a main claim usually comes at the beginning of an essay, though it can come at the end. And a thesis or a main claim should, in a nutshell, pull together in a sentence or two precisely what is going to be amplified or unpacked in the particular essay or chapter of a book that follows. And I think that's about all I have to say here for today. I'll stop sharing, and if we actually had a face-to-face class, I would stop and say, do you have any questions? But I'll reserve that for you. And if after having heard this lecture, seen this lecture, you have any questions, get back to me and I'll attempt to answer them. Happy reading. We've got some good selections for this week. We've made a huge jump historically into the Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, and we'll have more to say about this. Thanks.